For our next topic, we're going to take a look at sequences. Let's talk about some basic notation in this section. A sub 1 is going to represent our first term. A sub 2 is going to represent our second term. And this pattern is going to continue. We're going to let a sub n represent our nth term. Let's take a look at the following sequence. We have f of n equals 1 over n. Let's calculate our first couple terms of this sequence. A sub 1 is going to be the same thing as calculating f of 1. If we plug the n value of 1 into our function, we're going to get 1 over 1, which is equivalent to 1. So our first term in the sequence is a 1. If we want to calculate our second term, a sub 2, that's the same thing as calculating f of 2. If we put 2 into our function, we're going to get 1/2. So our second term is 1/2. Let's calculate our third term. A sub 3 is the same thing as f of 3, which is going to give us 1/3. And we can continue this pattern. Let's go ahead and calculate our nth term. If we continue this pattern all the way down, a sub n is going to be the same thing as f of n, which in our case is going to be the fraction 1 over n. Let's take a look at this example. We want to find the first 6 terms of the sequence, and we want to graph it. And we're given the sequence a sub n equals n minus 1 over n. Sometimes you're going to see these braces. That's going to allow you to represent a sequence using this formula for the nth term. When you see those braces around those segments, then that's going to represent the entire sequence. Let's go ahead and calculate our first 6 terms. If we calculate a sub 1, we're going to plug in 1 into our formula every time we see the letter n. So we're going to get 1 minus 1 on top, which is going to give us a 0, and a 1 on the bottom. Anytime we have 0 on top of a fraction, that's going to be the same thing as 0. So our first term in this sequence is 0. When we calculate a sub 2, we get 2 minus 1 on top over 2. So our second term is going to be 1/2. Let's go ahead and calculate the remaining terms that we have in this sequence. Our third term is 2/3. Our fourth term is 3/4. Our fifth term is 4/5. And our sixth term in the sequence is 5/6. Let's go ahead and take a look at how to graph this. When we go to graph this, one of the first things we might want to look at are the values that we were working with. In this case, we're going to be looking at the n value, or the term that we're looking at, and our f of n value. So for our first term, our n value of 1, when we plugged it into f of n, we had our first term came out to be a 0. So the first point we're going to plot is the point 1, 0. And as we move on, right, here's our next batch of points. So 2 1/2, 3 2/3, and so on. Let's take a look at the graph of these. Here's how I set up my graph paper. Along my x-axis, I have my n values. Since I was calculating the first 6 terms, I just have the numbers 1 through 6. And along my y-axis, I have my f of n values. Let's go ahead and start plotting these. Here I plotted point 1, 0, and 2, 1/2. Let's go ahead and do the last 4 terms. This is what the graph of our sequence would look like if we plotted our first 6 terms. Let's take a look at one more example. Let's take a look at the sequence b sub n, and our sequence is going to be defined as -1 to the nth power times the fraction n over 2. Let's go ahead and calculate our first 6 terms. Our first term, b sub 1, is going to be negative 1 to the first power times the fraction 1/2. That's going to give us a negative 1/2. Let's go ahead and calculate out the rest of the terms in this sequence. For b2, we're going to get negative 1, the whole thing squared, times the fraction 2 over 2. This is going to be the same thing as 1 times 1, or a second term of 1. For the rest of our terms, our third term is going to be a negative 3/2, or negative 1.5. Our fourth term is a 2. Our fifth term is a negative 5/2. And our sixth term is a 3. Let's go ahead and take a look at the graph of this sequence. Here's the setup of my graph. I'm going to be plotting the n values along my x-axis and the b sub n values along my y-axis. My first term was a negative 1/2, and my second term was at positive 1. Let me go ahead and plot the rest of my points. Here's the image of our graph for this sequence.